sees this. He sees this temple in the southern town of Nîmes, and it's an actual Roman temple, like from 2,000 years before. And he just falls in love with this little temple. And he writes to one of his female correspondents back in Paris, and he says, I am gazing at this temple like a lover at his mistress. So when I tell you that he really likes this temple, believe me, he really, really likes this temple like a mistress. And what he writes to his compatriots back in the new state of Virginia, it had been a colony 10 seconds before, but now it was a state, is that what they really needed to do was to create a new architecture for the new Rome that was taking root in North America after the American Revolution. So what they needed to do was to build all of the government buildings as exact replicas of this little temple in the south of France, former Gaul. And that is what happens. The state capitol building in Richmond, Virginia, has the distinction of being the first building in the early national period in American history since the American Revolution of being an exact replica of an ancient Roman building in order to advertise the civic virtue of the new Roman Republic. So this is what I mean about having our Roman goggles on or off, is that now when we look around the streets of the United States, we see all kinds of examples of this. We see mostly government buildings, right? Banks, post offices, schools, especially if they were built in the first part of the 20th century, all kinds of buildings that are in the shape of Roman temples. And they are so familiar to us that we do not pause to ask, why? Why is this civilization that's 2,000 years old and 3,000 miles away a model for how this very, very young nation wants to be? But what I'm asking you today is to put on your Roman goggles again and to see it for what it is, which is part of this exercise in being the mouse that roared. So this is a revolutionary moment in American architecture. Washington, D.C. is probably the best known example of this to you, of a city that it's a brand new city in the 1790s. It is literally planned out of thin air, or more accurately, a Virginia swamp, to carve out a vision of what the new republic would be. And the buildings are in the style of ancient Rome, as it should have been. So they're not painted in the gaudy colors that the Romans would have used. They're all pristine white, super virtuous. They bring in a little bit of ancient Egypt. And again, if I could give you the 8-hour lecture, we would say more about that. What's Egypt doing there? The Washington Monument is a symbol of the eternity of the new United States, because Egypt is the eternal civilization. So we need a little bit of that. The avenues are broad. They are not medieval crooked streets that prevent you from seeing around the corner. They are broad streets. They are the broad streets of the Enlightenment, so that I can see what I need to see. The sun comes down and illuminates the path forward, and it allows for the free assembly of the citizens of the United States to be able to come out into the public sphere and to do the first primal act of citizenship in the new republic, which is to cast their ballot for their representatives. They are no longer a monarchy. And this they think of as being ancient Roman. So next time you're in Washington, D.C., think about it as the new Rome. Okay, so slavery. Slavery is a really interesting topic for thinking about the place of ancient Rome in the United States. Ancient Rome and the United States were both what historians called slave societies. Slave societies, that's a technical term, a slave society, is a society when around 30% or more of the labor force is enslaved. And this was the case in the United States. It was the case in ancient Rome as well. At the moment of the American Revolution, there were approximately 800 or 900,000 slaves within the new 13 states. That number would increase to 4 million on the eve of the Civil War in 1861. So it began as a sort of slave society, and it ended that trajectory as really a slave society. Throughout that long journey, Americans who wanted to justify the institution of slavery looked to ancient Rome as examples of why they thought slavery was a virtuous institution and one that should be perpetuated. I'm showing you in this chart some of the differences between ancient Rome and American slavery and some of the overlaps. So American slavery very rapidly became race-based slavery, which is a long conversation, but that distinguishes it from ancient Roman slavery, which was raid and capture slavery across the ethnic spectrum. So it didn't distinguish based on race or ethnicity. It was really the source of slaves was mostly warfare, and right behind the army would come the slave traders to take slaves back as war booty for the farms of ancient Rome. In the United States, the source of slaves is not war. It is the government-sanctioned slave trade that brings anywhere between 12 and 25 million Africans to the United States, to the New World, to all of the Americas between 1492 and 1870. But in both cases, and this is why the Americans looked to the ancient Romans, approximately 30% of the population was enslaved. So for someone, we're going to stick with George Washington now just for some thematic continuity. For someone like George Washington, looking to ancient Rome was not just about civic virtue. It was also about justification of holding slaves at a moment when the first inklings of anti-slavery sentiment were being manifested. And so he built Mount Vernon in part as a form of self-justification for slavery, saying, well, the ancient Romans did it, and they were really great and really virtuous. So if I surround myself with the architecture and interior decoration of Rome, that helps to show that I am a sort of a virtuous planter in the way that the ancient Romans were as well. So George Washington had 317 slaves at his death in 1799. He emancipated those that were his to emancipate. Most of the slaves at Mount Vernon, however, came as part of the dowry of Martha Washington. They were therefore untouchable for him because they were legally hers, and he could not emancipate them. But there were 317 slaves. And as with Thomas Jefferson, a lot of those slaves had classical names. And that is not accidental. It was part of a kind of landscape of classicism that helped to feed the self-image, not of vice because you were slaveholding, but of virtue because you were a Roman slaveholder. And that freed you from the drudgery of work in the 18th century to pursue the noble activities of politics and philosophy, just as it had done for the ancient Romans. And those of you who visit the remaining plantation homes of the Cotton South, of the Deep South, like Alabama, Mississippi, it's the same thing going on there. George Washington had a personal servant, a slave. We think that we have a picture of him here in Billy Lee, although we're never sure. And notice that he's on the female side of the painting, right? So vice and female is over here. Weakness, debility, masculine, good, excellent, literacy is over here. So you're seeing it play out. So women and slaves were sort of put into the same category. See how it makes it easier now to look at 18th century paintings because you have your ammunition. And next time you go to Mount Vernon, they've really done an extraordinary job of redoing a lot of parts of Mount Vernon to show off the slave legacy these days. But look at the architecture as an example of this self-conceptualization off on the back porch, which looks at the Potomac. The classical columns are one side. And then on the interior, this is in the dining room, of course, this fancy Roman-style column work. But here is a little slave at the plow here in white marble. So these little insignia are everywhere throughout Mount Vernon.